I'm Emily West, the Executive Director of the West Foundation, and we are here today to have our convening on storytelling. We're very excited to be offering this to you because storytelling is something that the West Foundation has been talking about specifically since the late 90s, and we're excited to see that that it's starting to really come to the forefront in many, many ways. And we're excited that all of you today, as well as some folks that could not be with us, are excited to hear about it as well and incorporate more storytelling for effective work with their nonprofit or non-governmental organization. I am going to note to you this recording is being recorded, this convening is being recorded. We do that with all of our informative convenings, and those are later placed on our YouTube channel, the West Foundation, that's the name of it. And you can find, we will send you a link to our recording, but if you want to refer other people to the recording, you can easily do that by referring them to the channel on YouTube. With that, let me note and first of all, thank our speakers for today. Sarah Hummell. Sarah, you can just give a wave out maybe so people recognize who you are if you're not already noted so on your Zoom window. But Sarah has 15 years of experience in organizing and corporate management and also staffing for a variety of organizations. She recruits, builds, and trains successful teams, and she has hired more than 1,000 positions for in leadership as a professional headhunter. She has an advanced Gallup certified degree as a strength coach and is a member of the International Coaching Federation. And she has done a lot of corporate work for major organizations like Abercrombie and Fitch and Williams-Sonoma. Additionally, she moved from retail to politics in 2011 as a part of the Obama campaign for president in Ohio. And this started her work in the political space. Most recently in that respect, she trained over 200 candidates for office in Brazil on running effective grassroots campaigns. And she holds a BS in labor studies from Indiana University and describes herself as a proud Hoosier, which I totally agree with, being a proud Hoosier myself. So thank you for being here today, Sarah. And next, I want to introduce Michael Kass. Michael is an international facilitator, consultant, and also healer. He works with organizations and individuals to learn about how to weave stories and bringing everyone into greater connection with themselves and each other and the world at large. And he is the co-author of the Hollywood Homeless Youth Partnership's Ethical Storytelling White Paper, which is, I believe, a first of its kind in the sector, and serves on the Advisory Council for the International Dignified Storytelling Project. He also holds an ICF certification as an executive coach. He's also certified as a breathwork facilitator and has completed trauma-informed heart math facilitation training and integrative somatic trauma therapy training with the Embody Lab. Finally, I want to introduce Jessica Kizorek. Jessica works with video storytelling as only a part of her career, but she and her father founded Parrot Productions, which works with many nonprofits on, as well as entrepreneurs, on how to tell their stories and build movements through that. She works in multimedia with websites, social platforms, applications, and ebooks. And additionally, she works as an entrepreneur and international activist, working a great deal, I believe, within the women's movement and women's empowerment internationally. She also works with many large nonprofits such as AARP Foundation, Special Olympics, and Lions Clubs. That's all done through Parrot Productions, which she founded in 2001 with her father, Bill Kizorek. And she's created hundreds of short films and video-centric fundraising campaigns through that organization. She's also traveled to more than 60 countries internationally, covered many, many types of humanitarian causes as a journalist and documentarian. And she has most recently headed up efforts on education in Pakistan's largest refugee camp, World Women's Day in Nepal, and fair trade farming initiatives in Ghana. Much of the work that she does, and we'll cover a little bit more on this later, is made possible by donations to organizations from the Kizorek family. So they have a very wonderful and generous history of international support. And I obviously relate to that. So with that all said, welcome. And again, thank you to all our panelists today. We're going to start by asking the question, why is storytelling so important to the work of social change makers? And further than that, what makes a story compelling to all of you? I'm going to actually ask that first of Sarah, because Sarah has some interesting history and resources to provide around that. Sarah, you have done a lot of study in this area. Would you share some of that experience with us?
Yes, of course. And a big thank you to Emily for hosting and convening, Emily West for hosting and convening, and Emily Rice for making us all be here at the right time and have the right links and all the things to coordinate this. And know a lot goes behind the scenes for both of you. So I want to say thank you. And my storytelling came more to me. I was seeing it through retail, right? Because you're telling stories in stores. But when I reached the Obama campaign in Ohio in 2011, there was a lot of emphasis on teaching community organizers on how to tell their story. And it was just kind of brought to us as this framework, which I think is really helpful. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it's this concept of the story of self, which is about challenge, choice, and outcome. Well, it took some while to realize like they didn't invent that, but it came from Professor Marshall Gans, who is at Harvard. He's still teaching this class. You can take it online it's about social movements and social changes. And he has trained a lot of people in his classes, and two of such people were Barack and Michelle Obama, who took his class. And then I had the privilege of spending a whole day with him training 6 members of Congress on telling their story and being a part of that process. But he really frames it out in a way that is kind of easy to follow. You feel like it's hard to tell your story. And like story of self is just those pieces, but the big story can kind of be seen as the story of self, us, and the now. So like the now is where the urgency comes in, and the us is this connection where the others can see themselves in your eyes. You shouldn't be such the hero of the story that like, oh, I could never be Emily, like, so I'm not even going to try. But if you can see themselves in each other's eyes, like that's where kind of the magic happens. And one of the best nuggets of advice I got from him in person was to, when you're telling your stories, is to describe the space you're in. And for example, there was a member of Congress who was talking about her parents and a really hard time and decision point in their life about money and where they're going to live. And her story just started off very quickly of like, my parents were talking in the kitchen and they were whispering. They could tell I was trying to hear. So they went into their bedroom, they shut the door. I went into my bedroom, put my ear against the wall because we shared the wall. And then she says the most profound thing. She says, then in that moment, as I was looking at the blue shag carpet, I had just heard my father say he lost his job. And that, I just call those the blue shag carpet moments, because all of us looked down at that and saw that. We probably saw the silly lamps on the nightstand next to her bed and the ruffle of bedding on her bed. It's like wherever you can get people to visually go with you is a really wonderful connection point.
Great, great, thank you. And it's very interesting to hear about Marshall Gantz, who I think you described as the guru of storytelling. And then there's also been, I believe, some studies done that you've mentioned on the neuroscience of storytelling and what that does to the brain.
Yes, thank you. So the neuroscience is often something I work with people if they're like, oh, my story doesn't matter. It's not going to have a much impact. Why do I have to tell my story, Sarah? And I just like our brains are wired for story. Think about stories like the history since the dawn of time, right? And telling effective stories are memorable. And you can probably all remember stories you heard when you were younger, told by people that were powerful, impactful. But get out of that, and like if you have a really analytical audience, I always love to show them this brain scan. And this is talking about we have our limbic system and our prefrontal cortex, so getting a little neurosciency on you. But in narrative stories, so a narrative is and but so, and a non-narrative story is and I went to the store and there was an accident and it was raining and the dog got out of the car. Like that's not very compelling and it's not very engaging. So when you look at the top scans, that's a brain listening to a story that introduces, like, I went to the grocery store and it was raining. There was a bad accident, but I couldn't get there. Like you just format this out so that people want to listen more, and it just literally writes up people's brains. And I just kind of want to remind you, so when you're in that and format, you're really in your limbic system, you're really in your I'm sorry, in your prefrontal cortex, like that's the rational brain. You kind of live there a lot. Like it's you're 30% making decisions. It's just like a little slow. It's intentional. You're making efforts and you're making choices. Where we get into that emotional brain, it's just part of the limbic system. That's fast. It's intuitive. It's automatic. It's effortless. And that's where people engage with you. So when telling a non-narrative versus narrative story, that's the kind of difference you're getting. And this is what people's brains are doing as they're listening to it.
Amazing. That really is something I had no idea of. And so so I want to actually ask Michael and Jessica what the same kind of question, although I suspect your answers will come from very different areas than this. That's kind of the neurological explanation, but then how does that stimulation of the brain translate to things that are important for nonprofits and non-governmental organizations to create social change?
I'll jump in
Go ahead,
maybe
Michael.
because I want to geek out a little bit more on the neuroscience because I think it's
Sure.
it's it's important. That lighting up the brain, I think one of the things that makes it so important for movement building is it's not individual, it's collective, right? So
Hmm.
it's a phenomenon that's called neural coupling. So if you remember, if you think of the slide that Sarah showed us, imagine Barack Obama was a master of this. The only reason it works is if the storyteller's brain lights up, right?
Hmm.
If the storyteller is not engaged, and nonprofits are notorious for telling beautifully structured stories that are dead. If you were to do a brain scan, nobody's brain would be lit up, which means their audience's brain isn't lit up, which means nobody's moved at all, right? Um,
Hmm.
so if we think of it, I come to this work from a different avenue. I'm as a performer and like a performance storyteller, right? And at the same time, I was working for nonprofits, and I just remember so distinctly standing in front of audiences of like hundreds of people and not, especially early on, not trusting that story would work, right? So telling a story about, for example, my first love and feeling the emotions in my body
Hmm.
and then getting off stage and people coming up to me and for some reason telling me their story of their first love. And I'm like, you don't know me. That's a really tender thing to trust a stranger with. And it made me so curious to learn more about story and also to hold the fact that I had worked at that point on staff as a fundraiser for, small organizations, large organizations, and universally, they did amazing work and were disastrous at communicating about their work. They would talk about numbers, they would talk about their mission, and I would be in the room and just feel the room get colder as people didn't care. They would be like, that's too many numbers. Research shows our brains can only hold 3 statistics. And after that, it's just mush. It's just mush, right? So I started getting really curious about, well, and at the time, I didn't know about public narrative and Marshall Gantz, and I thought I was making up something new because this was like 2010. I'm like, I'm a revolutionary. And thankfully, right, I found it. I was like, oh, somebody's already done this. Great. I can share this. And especially for leaders, being able to really trust, and for a lot of folks who have been educated in Western dominant culture, there's a tremendous distrust of nonlinear data, right? There's a tremendous distrust of emotion as something that actually can move people to action. And so a lot of my work is establishing communities of practice where nonprofit leaders, people in movements actually get together and just share stories with each other
Mm-hmm.
and then reflect about how moved they were, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think the elements of stories that make them work, that create that neural coupling. And there's another cool piece of research done by a guy named Paul Zak around the endocrine system. So when we're wired for stories, actually, a good story will elicit the release of oxytocin in our bloodstream,
Mm-hmm.
which is our empathy hormone. So literally, without story, as a species, we would not have survived. We wouldn't have had any reason to like each other and to do things for each other. Um, Anyway, the things that make it come alive are, like Sarah was saying, those blue shag carpet moments wake up our senses. So, right, specifics make a story come alive. And often it's like weird details like blue shag carpet or an engraving on a doorknob. It's never the details that we think. It's always the ones that we almost always brush over. The other two are like authenticity, which does not mean full disclosure. And I think that gets conflated a lot in nonprofit storytelling, where especially leaders or people with lived experience feel like they need to share the worst thing that's ever happened to them in
Yes.
order to garner support. And there's a lot of reasons why storytelling evolved that way, and it's incredibly harmful to everyone, right? To the storyteller, to the audience, and to the sector as a whole, and to donors, because we're doing them a disservice, right? By sharing these sensationalized stories. Um, and then so we could be, what I tell people often is you can be 100% authentic and 0.1% vulnerable, and your story will still work, right?
Mm-hmm.
You never, stories are sacred. We never have to share more than is safe, right? Ever, ever, ever.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third aspect that I think a lot about in making a story effective is structure. And the
Yes.
reason I think a lot about it is it's overrated. Like, people focus so much on structure and then they lose the heart, they lose the specifics. And especially in the nonprofit sector, it's gotten to the point now that stories become this thing that people are super jazzed on. Every story starts to sound the same, right? Emily
Mm-hmm.
wasn't doing well. She was having a rough time. She had a blue shag carpet and cried herself to sleep at night. But then she found us. Uh, she went through our program. Now she's better. Give us money, right? No, that type of story 10 years ago kind of felt interesting. Nobody cares anymore. It just doesn't land. And so how can we really challenge ourselves as change makers, as movement leaders, as whatever it is we do in the world, um, to get more interested in our own stories and the mundane moments that make up transformation,
Mm-hmm.
and help invite audiences into that. And the key to that, I think, is trust.
Okay, and so establishing trust becomes a means of or a reason why storytelling is important to the work of change makers, because particularly if you are working with donors, you're trying to establish trust between your organization and the donor, or you and your organization and the beneficiaries that's helping.
Yeah.
That's another reason why storytelling is important. It's not just about earning dollars. It is, but it can be an amazing way of of sharing and then trust building. I think you also had mentioned to me at one point it can also be a very effective way of team building within an organization, of also ensuring the mental well-being of the practitioners within the organization, or their beneficiaries, depending on the use of the story. And so, you can overcome fear and apathy. You can, but it's definitely a way to reach whatever audience you're trying to develop a relationship with. And that's something I want to include Jessica in, because Jessica, you have for many years worked in developing stories directly. And so I know, for example, you have you do the videos. This is your primary means of storytelling. How much of this do you think applies to video storytelling, and what do you think makes a compelling video storytelling session? I think you're muted.
Okay, great.
There we go. There we go.
There's
I've
so
done it
many
10
great
times.
things that Sarah and Michael said that I could build on. I have like a page full of notes already. But I think why I was invited to be part of this is that I come from a very specific angle here, which is the role that video plays in storytelling. And there's a lot of different kinds of storytelling. You know, there's email marketing, there's social media storytelling, there's Google PPC storytelling. I mean, and so the role that video plays, I think, is very specific in building, like Michael was talking about, building authenticity and building trust, because we now really live in the age of AI, where there's so much misinformation and there's so much hallucinations and false information out there that I was, you know, over the last few years, as I've watched AI develop, I'm like, oh, it's going to steal my job. But the more that I realize, the more important documentary filmmaking is, because it's like an authenticated stamp of approval that's like, okay, you know, my charity went here and it impacted these people. And we're like, one of my clients was the National WIC Association, which is basically like food stamps. And we went to 12 different branches of the WIC, like 12 different rural WIC offices, and they had gotten millions of dollars each to be able to implement programs and stuff. And we were actually interviewing, you know, the mother who got the food stamps, who's holding the baby in her arm and showing us her SNAP card and talking about, you know, before and after in the fresh food markets and everything. There's so much there's so much that gets conveyed through human to human experience, and having spokespeople for your organization that can authentically talk about how amazing their journey with your organization has been. I think that you know, one of the things that Michael said was, he talked about, you know, how the storyteller needs to get involved and you need to be animated as a storyteller. And that's why interviews are so crucial to this equation of being able to use video and tell stories, is that you're animating the people, you're asking them to bring their real emotions to the table, you're asking inquisitive questions, you're asking probing questions, you're also, one of the things that I've found, a lot of nonprofits find it very difficult to talk about, like, the problem that they address. And, you know, you've got, like, one of our clients is a homeless shelter. So, you know, you have to sort of talk about how bad it is to be homeless in order to cultivate the kind of empathy and the kind of exchange, right, that you're doing. So I always really encourage my clients to, you know, spend, if you're going to do a 3 to 5 minute video, spend 30 seconds talking about, like, you know, how scary it is. Like, we had another client that was the Florida Association of Free and Charitable Clinics. And so they talked about how scary it is to go to the emergency room and not have health insurance and not be able to take care of yourself and be building up debt. And those kind of things just cultivate the the space where people can say, the organization can be the hero of the sort of story. And as we were looking at structure, I know Sarah was talking about going to like a really visual place, the structural storytelling, and we were talking about all sorts of different things, but if there's also one neurological comment that I can make, the part of neurology that really applies to what I do is called the vagus nerve. And it's basically, like Michael was talking about coupling, neural coupling, and like things happening in groups. That happens between two people, between the interviewee and the person watching the video. If the person, for instance, if they cry on screen, the crying of the person on the screen, because they're so grateful for this organization that's helped them survive through their homelessness, the more that they can emotionally convey that, it triggers in the other person their vagus nerve, so it makes them feel emotionally connected. It makes them feel like they're tearing up. If any of you ever watched a video and you're tearing up, that's like the best kind of video, because they've figured out how to take you on an emotional journey and how to make you feel like you're part of the story, like you're part of the solution, so that you're more apt to take out your checkbook and write checks.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I always think back to, some people listening to this will be too young to remember the days of AT&T television commercials, where they would have the soldier calling home on the AT&T phone booth on the street, and it would always, you would get a lump in your throat, because it was so you would relate to it, and it would engage your emotions, because everybody can relate to that need to be able to reach out to family, and at the same time, because that is compelling. At the same time, you want to be careful, that, as Michael was noting, that you do not overstep into something that is exploitative. And that's where picking and choosing, I think, what elements of the story you're going to tell, and maybe not telling in such huge depth, get enough of the detail of how frightening it is maybe to be homeless, and all the difficulties one encounters of being homeless, and the fact that there's many reasons people are homeless. It's not because they're all drug addicted or something, which a lot of people still sadly believe, but that there's a human story to how somebody maybe became homeless, and then you say what the difficulties are. And so, Michael, I'm going to throw that back to you and say, in your work in ethical storytelling, where do we draw the line with that? How do we, let's say we hire Jessica to make a short documentary film for us, and we want to tell that story, and we want to grab those emotions, but how do we keep from exploiting, maybe potentially exploiting? Where do we draw that line? Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of complexity to that question, and
Of
a lot of
course.
it goes to, like, it's always a process, right? So there's a lot of gray area in this conversation. But there are two tools that were sort of sparking for me as Jessica was talking. One was, it's called asset framing, and it was developed by a brilliant guy named Trabian Shorters, working specifically with young Black men. And asset framing is exactly what it sounds like. It means whatever the first thing is we learn about somebody, whether it's in writing, video, whatever, it wants to be a strength or an asset. And then we introduce the challenge, right? So an example, I was working with the domestic violence shelter in California, and they sent me a video, like a fundraising video they had done. And it started with these young women just sharing the most horrific things about the circumstances that led them to the shelter, right? And it worked, right? I felt things, I felt emotions. But it did two things. One, because of something called the anchoring effect, it meant that anybody who watched that video, no matter how many amazing successes these young women had after, that first thing they learned created a lens through which all of that other stuff was viewed, right? And so no matter what, these young women, first and foremost, would be people who had had these horrendous experiences, as opposed to leaders in their community, mothers, college graduates, chefs, right? Whatever their thing was. So the shift that we made wasn't to in any way downplay what they had been through, but rather to start with just the young women saying like, I'm a chef, I'm a mother, I'm a whatever, and then saying, and here's how I got here. So right now the anchor is something really powerful about them. So the other thing that's important about that is always understanding, especially in social impact work, the story that we're inside of, meaning every one of our organizations arose in a profoundly inequitable and flawed system. And when we share stories, going back to Trabian Shorters, and let's say it's about young Black men, and every story starts with like, this young man was in a gang. This young man was a father in prison. This young man was this. This is reinforcing stereotypes and received social norms, right? And so by using that tool of asset framing, not only are we like preserving and uplifting the dignity and voices of our storytellers, we're also leveraging soft power or narrative influence to subtly and way too slowly, but it does work, start to change the assumptions that people make, right? When they meet folks like women who are in shelters or young men who are experiencing homelessness, right? So instead of seeing a drug addict or a victim, suddenly we see somebody who loves swimming or an aspiring musician.
Yes.
And the rest are just conditions. So that's one. The other thing that I find really important, and I'd love to hear from like Jessica on this, is like the consent piece, especially for video these days, is so important. And what I often encourage organizations to do, especially if they're working with folks who have been through some stuff, is to put a time limitation on the consent, right? So instead of like a blanket consent form where it's like, hey, we're going to use your image in this promotional video, thank you so much. It's you're giving us permission to use this story on video in these settings for 1 year. We will check in with you at the end of the year, because the truth is, especially with folks who are navigating some intensity, how many euphemisms can I come up with the word trauma, right? Like some intensity. The story that they tell in 2024 may no longer be something they want to tell or have out there in 2025. And yet, because of video and the way video works, if I see that story in 2025 and then I meet that person, all I'm going to see is that story. I won't see them now, right? Same, it's that anchoring effect. And so something that I encourage people to be careful about is videos forever. And if it's on social media, it's really, or YouTube. I mean, I've had clients who they had people, they kept the video up on YouTube, and like one young woman's boss came up to her and 5 years after she'd recorded the video and said like, I saw the video, it was so amazing, I had no idea you'd been through that. I just want to say how much I appreciate you. Everybody had the best intentions, and it brought back the full strength of that young woman's trauma, right? So it was totally like all this stuff is unintentional. It's just being really conscious of centering the humanity and the well-being and the heart of everybody. This is a long answer, but those are two tools, right? Asset framing and I call it deep consent, like a deep consent process.
Jessica, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Since I know Michael was directing a lot of his conversation to you at that moment. You're still on mute again.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right.
I've had the landscapers blowing in the front yard, so I've had myself on mute. So no, I think that deep consent is a really interesting concept, and that it is very relevant for these days in the age of video is forever. I do think that is a good example of, somebody that, gave consent at one point and maybe didn't want to give consent at a later point. Although I have to say I represent the interests of my clients, and giving them a false deadline of when they have to take something off of YouTube because maybe somebody might not want it seen anymore, I don't know that I would recommend that to any of my clients, but that's just the angle that I come from, making sure that the clients have all the clearances and that nobody does come to them in the future and say, oh, I regret saying that. So, you know, I'm the one that's always having to get the actor releases signed and having to say, you know, people on video agree to be filmed and all of that kind of thing.
Also an important point, I think. Again, a lot of this is walking very delicate lines of balance between point and counterpoint. And I think that's important for people that are developing their stories, whether they're written stories or whether, because that can occur just as much with a written story as it can with a video story. Although I think the video, of course, is such a visceral medium that's where the tendency to worry about this issue tends to go. But for I think these are things to remember for all of us as we're developing stories for whatever purpose. I also am, I'm going to mention here, because we've been talking about some of this one, and storytelling is one of the things we do at the West Foundation, and is literally talk about a 3-act story structure. And we do this because we still ask for narrative proposals as opposed to putting the 2,000 character box in and asking you to give us certain answers to certain questions within that framework. And that's been at the request of our constituent organizations that we fund, because they hate that I call it the dreaded 2,000 character box, because everybody hates working with it. But in our description of how to put together your narrative or how to organize it, we will talk about a 3-act story structure that every story, whether it's a novel, a movie, of a TV show, a play, sometimes even poems, are in a 3-act story structure where you have, I know this goes against what you were saying, Michael, but sometimes for just in order to understand how to at least think about your story, I think putting it in a framework of a 3-act story structure is very important. And then you can go back and reorder things. But Act 1 is the presentation of your characters or your organization in this case, and a problem for them to resolve, which also may be a societal problem that your organization is there to assist in solving. Act 2 is what the characters do to resolve the problem introduced in Act 1. In the case of a nonprofit organization, it's what actions do you take in order to solve the problem you exist to resolve. And then Act 3 is what are your outcomes, or what happened to these characters as a result of undertaking the actions that were presented in Act 2. And so that's at least a structure to go by in figuring out what story you're telling, I think. And then if you want to reorder it based on introducing somebody who loves swimming, for example, so that you avoid the pitfall of playing into tropes. But I do think it is helpful for beginning storytellers to at least look at what a 3-act story structure would be for their story. So I just wanted to add that in, and I still like it for our narratives on our proposal, but that's easily found on our website if anyone wants to take a look at it, under our guidelines tab for proposal development. So you can find that at thewestfoundation.org. Yes,
and Emily, I think you're right on target, because if there's one sort of storytelling structure, I love storytelling structures, and I know you don't want to get stuck in them like Michael says, but the the story structure I love the best, that's probably the most global and popular, is the hero's journey. So really looking at, like, Joseph Campbell wrote a great book, I'm sure some of you guys read, about the hero's journey, the myth, what is it called? Really framing your characters. So like Michael says, you're putting them in a position of being seen in a positive light, you know. And I think it's really important that the viewer gets, that the interviewee gets supported and empowered in telling their story and being the hero of the story instead of the organization necessarily. You want to empower the people that are the beneficiaries. And you know, the more you can Google, like I've done it a million times before, you can Google like you know, heroes myth, the hero's storytelling, and it comes up like great diagrams of how to go through and how to, and that's it. If you look at Hollywood stories, I mean, almost every Hollywood movie or TV show has a hero's journey in it. And I think that's a great way to frame important stories with video.
I like the use of, I'll come back to you just a second, Michael. I like the use of the word empowerment, because I'll briefly note that I took a friend of mine to Santa Fe one time. I was going there for work purpose. She was going to visit Santa Fe, having never been there. But I said, you have to come with me to this 1 hour-long symposium about artisan handicrafts. And then we'll go, and there's a luncheon afterward. We'll go to that. She came in, she said later, she was so enthused at the end. She said, I came in expecting it would be sad stories about women in poverty, having nothing and eking out existence with their artisan handicrafts. And instead I found this empowering stories about women whose husbands suddenly were respecting them and calling them madam for the first time in their 20-year marriage and saying, can I have some money, madam? You know, and she said, these women are so empowered. And I think that is an excellent element of any story, is an empowerment element. And I think that's where it helps you avoid the pitfall of what we might sometimes call poverty porn, or what is maybe better called unethical storytelling. So Michael, I'm sorry, I just wanted to interject that into the conversation. Please go ahead with what you were going to say.
No, I just yeah, I want to first kind of highlight what Jessica said about making sure that the beneficiary is the hero of the story. Because what's happened, unfortunately, with the hero's journey is that it is the #1 reason that poverty porn evolved.
Yes.
And the reason that happened is that it got oversimplified, right? So like, it's actually a really nuanced 12-step journey, and it got it got collapsed because there's so much complex, like there's mentors and then there's getting lost, like it's very nuanced. It got compressed to person in bad situation, we save them, now they're better, right? And so really understanding and working with somebody like Jessica or Sarah or me, who really can hold that structure in a good way, I think becomes really important. The other thing that I'd kind of add, and this is another tool that people can use, is that structure tends to push organizations towards big transformational arc stories, right? Homeless to housed, gangbanger to CEO, whatever. That's generally in our organizations not what success looks like. It's the small day-to-day relational moments of surprise, of gratitude, of reciprocity. And so what I often advocate for, and these stories, because of the way we're wired, are just as powerful as the big transformation stories, is like, what are those small moments that we can highlight and feed them into the hero's journey and move away from those grand transformational arc stories? Because again, those do a disservice to everybody. If you think, if I'm a donor, I'm on the receiving end of that story, suddenly now I assume that that's what success looks like for the organization, that every person who comes through is going to get housed. And that is, having worked with many homeless service organizations, that's simply not what happens. It's not how things work. So how can we help reattune people to those small, intimate epics, is what they're called, that hold the energy of transformation, right? So, and then put it into the structure.
Yes. I think that is a very good way to put that. And that it is, the story of anybody's work that they do, let's say on the ground in a country in the global South, is a very complicated story. And so the stories of the individual people are going to be complex as well. And it isn't just a question of you moved from not being able to send your children to school to being able to send your children to school. There's many nuances in there. So I want to move on before we run out of time in our hour, and because this is such an interesting topic, and all four of us here are so passionate about this topic that we could go on and on, and on talking about it, and hopefully we will at another juncture. But I want to ask a question. I want to ask all of you. We've kind of started delving into this, but how should we consider framing our stories to be the most effective, moving away from the unethical storytelling? Let's assuming but what other elements should we consider in how we tell our stories? And for example, who will the audience be? How will you get your story out to the public? That kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you all have advice on those issues.
I would love to. I'll have this be one of my closing comments. But we recently just did. We funded 6 video programs. Six. And my parents are small funders of the organization, so I sat them down and I had them watch all 6 videos. And I studied which videos they liked best, and they're 6 great videos, but the one that they liked the best, the whole video, was a child who was probably like 11 years old telling her story of how much she loved the Boys and Girls Club. And she walked around with her best friend holding hands, and she gave a tour, and she pulled out the iPads and says, "We do STEM Saturday, and it's so cool to have somewhere to go on Saturdays." And she just toured. She showed us where the art corner was, but the whole thing was just this girl talking about her experience with the Boys and Girls Club. And it's so moving. I think that people underestimate the power of children in storytelling. Because you really, when you authentically get them to be themselves, it releases this sense of like vulnerability on behalf of the viewer, where they can sort of melt a little bit and trust this child. Like a child doesn't lie to you the same way an adult does. So if I could suggest anything, it would be, have children be part of your story and tell your story, and use the beneficiaries again as the hero of the story.
Sarah, you have been more quiet today than I should have allowed you to be. But do you have thoughts on framework for storytelling?
Yes, of course. And it's going to go back to Marshall Gans, and I've sat in many campaign offices learning the story. And I think what's interesting, when I met Marshall, he's like, "Sarah, why are you doing this work?" And I gave him a little spiel about something. He goes, "Yeah, I don't think that's it." And he walked away. Then they're like, it was lunch break or coffee break. He's like, "Sarah, have you thought about it?" And I was like, "Okay, so yes." And I think it was at this point in my life, he goes, "You were younger than that." And then he walked away from me. So it's like getting shade from Marshall Gans all day, but he really was pointing out that we have all these things about us at a very young and early age, and trying to find out what that thing is for you is really important. I think I kind of can now point back to wanting to be in community and organizing and activism. It's like my parents, when I was very young, thought a landfill that was going to be almost across the road from us on our farm. So I think just watching what that looked like and how do you fight that and how do you organize that, I think I was probably pretty intrigued by that process, but it took me several years after seeing Marshall. I think that might have been the moment. But I think following his framework is really great. And I'm going to share here in the chat what that is, and an article that you can get in a worksheet you can do for yourself. Wonderful. But just think about it as a challenge. So what is our shared problem? Because it's not just my problem, it has to be shared, because no one's going to care if it's not shared. It's like, what is the choice coming out of that? And for a lot of people running for offices, is like, I chose to run for office, or, you know, whatever the choice is, or what is a better alternative choice than what exists, or even what's the choice if we don't fix it, like it's going to get worse. And then the outcome, which is like, what is the result of that decision? And then kind of closing it with this ask, which is meaning like you're asking other people to join you and to be along this journey with you, and making them feel included in that process. But yes, I'll share some things in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you so much, because we love to not just have a healthy discussion, but to be able to provide practical resources for everyone that attends. I appreciate that so much, as well as what Jessica said she's going to provide. And Michael, I know you have things that you've already provided. So, but thank you for that too. Michael, did you have things you wanted to add about the framework?
Sure. I mean, just to build on what Sarah was saying, I think for me, the number one reason stories go sideways is they're the wrong story for your audience. Like you could have the most amazing story in the world, but if it's the wrong audience, it's not going to land. And so I think the part that often goes neglected is your story. Nobody actually cares what you have to say. Right? Nobody cares about your mission. There's an inner circle that does. But
Yes.
how do we meet people where they are? And it's never with statistics, right? And so the question is always not just what do we want our audience to do or what's going to elicit an emotional response. For me, it's also where are they starting, right? What are their beliefs and mental frameworks around you and your work? If they have any, they might not even know, or they may have. I've worked with organizations where their board doesn't even understand what they do, right? And
Sadly,
so,
that's very true.
right. And so what kind of story can we tell that's going to take them on a journey from wherever they are to where we'd like them to end up? Right. And that for me is the gold standard, because then we can bring all of this stuff about structure and authenticity and ethics into place. But if we haven't dialed in that audience journey, then we're sort of gambling a little bit. We're like, well, we like it, but
Yes.
we also spend all day every day working on our work, right?
Well, yes. And I think that touches on I totally agree with that. And because some audiences are more receptive to certain things and some audiences are more receptive to other things. But primarily it's pulling me back to something you said the other day that was about, sorry, I sidelined myself and then I got off my story track. So lesson learned to people, don't transgress on yourself. But I've lost it. I'll move on. It'll come back to me. I'll interject it later. But I do think it is some people are I've literally seen people because they weren't ready to hear a story and perhaps that reject the story. And I've seen organizations be fearful that they're going to tell a story that that is not going to be accepted by the listener and not even want to tell the story, even though the listener was prepared to hear the story. So understanding your audience often is and that's another one of those fine lines, because you have to be prepared. Sometimes your audience is larger than your ability to modify your story. And that's what it took me back to, was you said the other day about you're constantly going to be refining your story. There is no such thing as telling it right, because it's not like it's a transmutable thing. It is not something that is fixed and forevermore, world without end, amen. And so the ability to gauge your story to your audience is very important. One time, I'll just give this an example. We work with CARE, that big famous care package organization. Yes. And my contact there gave me a menu of 4 different types of 4 projects that they would like us to consider funding. Which one interests you? I said, as we do in our foundation, which one is the hardest one for you to get funded? And she said, the one in Mali preventing child trafficking to Cote d'Ivoire. And I said, why on earth is that the hardest one to get funded? She said, well, I'm not even sure we want to present that to you. I probably shouldn't even have mentioned it because we're worried your father won't like it. I said, why would my father not like to help people, children from being trafficked? She said, because he's older and because some of this trafficking winds up, the young women get used as slave labor on farms, and then they're raped and trafficked for sex as well. And I said, no, I guarantee you he would think that was awful and want to stop it. And I said, let me present this to him. And of course, his response was, why would I not want to fund that? And so I knew the audience, of course, better than she did, having grown up with him. But I've conversely told a story about sex trafficking in Thailand to a friend of mine, who is very educated and very good-hearted and very generous person. And I said, yeah, we're funding this to prevent young women from being sold by their families into the sex traffic system in Bangkok. And she says, well, I guess if the families are so much uncaring that they would sell their daughters into sex slavery, then they can't be that much worse off in Bangkok than they are at home on their farms. And that literally was a thing where somebody literally could not handle that concept. And I'm not saying you shouldn't introduce that concept, but you have to do it very carefully. She literally shut it down, and had to make it go away by rationalizing that. And so that's something also to be considered in gauging your story to your audience. Just very, very important. And I think in that instance, I didn't probably gauge, I should have found a better way to tell that story. I wasn't trying to get her to give money. I was just sharing what we do, but it taught me a lesson, let's say. So we are now at, I'm gonna have to bring this to a close, because if you all would mind taking 10 minutes extra overtime, we're at 2:58. Would you mind taking 10 extra minutes? And I'm gonna open up to questions and answers. But already this has been, for me, a fascinating organization, or fascinating conversation. But I hope, and so I hope it has been for everyone else. But does anyone want to submit, either just take yourself off mute and ask a question, or conversely, you can submit it through chat if you're shy. And Emily, I'll ask you, have we received any questions I'm unaware of? I see.
We don't have any questions in the chat yet. That's
what I thought, but just double checking, because sometimes I get very busy talking to people in the panel and forget to check the chat. So thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Catherine from Kickstart.
Hi.
I really appreciated hearing everyone's insights. And I was struck by the example of the child that was just like offering her perspective, and it sounded like a real protagonist of the story. And I guess I was curious if you had any guidance or advice about bringing that side out in your beneficiaries. How do you help them tell their story? Not everyone like is really adept always naturally, or just kind of like it's an awkward situation sometimes sharing their story with like an organization that they know is going to be communicated. So yeah, just curious about that side of story learning to tell the story.
Yeah, if the question is directed at me, I think that the way when I produce a documentary, we almost reverse engineer the interview questions, because what we do is we create like a one-page script, which is basically like the bullets that an organization would want to go into their 3 to 5 minute video. So it's, bullet number 1, we've been doing this since 1972 and we've impacted 100,000 people. Bullet number 2, and we go through bullets. Now, we don't give the bullets to the interviewees. I don't like giving the bullets to the interviewees, but what we do is we look at those bullets and we reverse engineer the interview questions so that we are getting people to talk about the things that we want them to talk about, so we can construct the story that we're looking for. So, I would also say that each interviewee, when we're doing a 3 to 5 minute documentary, the most people I like to have in there is about like 6 people. That's almost too many. But you, each interviewee is going to have different perspective and different interview questions, and they're going to be the ones that say different parts of the story. So as you're an organization trying to tell their story, you want to really think about the interview questions and what can you ask each different interviewee to get this amalgamation of your 1 page of bullets that belongs in the 3 to 5 minute documentary.
I just dropped in the chat one of my favorite tools to do that, Catherine, which is a little bit different. Like the way, because I never am this, like, I'm not editing a video, right? So my job is so different than Jessica's. And so I'm really focused on the community unlocking each other's stories. And this structure I've dropped in called appreciative interviewing from a toolkit called Liberating Structures is a really low barrier entry way of doing that, because it helps people kind of identify the key moments in their stories and feel the impact it has on others, whether it's peers or if you're doing kind of a cross ecosystem-wide group. But the idea that I often go with is I will never ask anybody for a story, because most people can't do it. Most people get all bunged up in their head. But I'll say it's like, hey, tell me about a moment that surprised you. And then you watch them go like, huh. And then they'll go, I guess I got surprised the other day when Sarah handed me a sandwich. Oh, what kind of sandwich? It was a ham sandwich. How'd it taste? And their whole face lights up. And now you're in the energy of story, right? So it can help to like break it down a little bit. I for whatever that's worth, that's kind of the approach I tend to take.
It's helpful. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask?
I don't have a question per se, but wanted to kind of reiterate what Emily put in the chat. This has been super helpful. I am a regional fundraiser for a nonprofit that works in some really difficult places. And so being able to kind of get names to different things that I kind of intuitively have thought about in terms of storytelling, and just advice and advice that's practical, is super helpful. So it's been really interesting. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing. Does anyone else have any thoughts they'd like to share, or conversely ask another question? I'm not hearing anybody. I'm going to take a minute to ask Michael and Jessica and Sarah if they have any final thoughts they would like to share about anything we haven't managed to cover today. I know, Jessica, you mentioned something to me in our phone conversation. Did we cover about that? You wondered if we would have time for it. And I'm blanking on, forgive me, I'm blanking on what it was, but if you're looking blank too, so perhaps we did cover.
Yeah. Well, I'll just one final thing. As you look at where to put your video, if you're producing a video or you want to get funding to produce a video, that one of the key ways that you're going to raise money with that video is by putting it in the hands of your board of directors, and giving your board of directors something that they can email to their friends, something that they can share with their daughter or their husband or whatever, something that's shareable and in an email that also gives context to it, because your board members are probably some of the most passionate people about your organization, and there's the expectation that they're going to fundraise, but a lot of board members are very ineffective when it comes to fundraising. And I find that equipping them with a good video is crucial.
Yeah.
I would agree. Go ahead, Michael. I would agree.
I was gonna take that sideways
Yes.
and say yes. And I think one of the things that happens, and it's happened in this conversation, right, is we talk about storytelling as fundraising. And Emily, you brought in the idea of like storytelling is an internal practice. And one of the things that, I'm passionate about is if you're only doing storytelling as communication or fundraising, you're missing it. You're missing it, right? And so what does it look like for staff to come together and share their stories? What does it look like for staff and board? Because there's often this weird tension there to come together and share stories with each other,
I
right?
love that.
Using some of these same tools, like the tools Jessica was talking about, or appreciative interviewing. That's something that I think, I was at a workshop recently and one of the participants asked, like, wait, do we do this internally too, or just externally? And I was like, whoa, let's back up. Yes. Like, yes, please do it internally, because otherwise you're going to be out of whack, right? Your communication and your internal culture are going to be misaligned, almost inevitably. So that's one more piece I would drop in.
I think I agree with that so much, because I think it's important if you're going to work at being good storytellers, and some organizations have a very difficult story to tell, not because it's so tragic or that they're not doing important work, but because it doesn't naturally have an emotional element to it to bring forward. And so part of the way to overcome that, I think, is by inculcating storytelling as a part of your organizational culture. And that's what you're talking about doing, I believe. And so that's one thing to remember. Sarah, you have your hand up that you would like to say something.
I would love to. One thing to think about with stories. So whenever I do any leadership programs, campaign related or not, like the first cohort meeting, we do story together. And but think about story in such a holistic way. It should, now I'm going to put my fundraising hat on because I haven't had it on this whole time, honestly, but be consistent in your message, whatever you're saying in your mail, on digital, on TV, if you have the opportunity to be on TV, on your weekly emails, like you have to say the same thing and be saying it everywhere. And just because you tell your story once, that's not enough. Like a human has to hear something 7 times before it even begins to burn into those brains. So just be really holistic with your approach, and also be very, very consistent with that. And then also in terms of donors, like sometimes it's hard for them to quantify where my money is going, I have found, because I'm always making the case for why you should pay for training and organization, especially if the startup is to raise $3 million and spend down to 0 by election day. But one thing I love to make for them is a handout of, okay, X amount of dollars provide, and you probably do this, but this provides one training, or this provides a flight for a member to be in this cohort to fly to their in-person training. Like giving them like the tangibles of what that money does. It seems to be like also just telling your story of what you're doing, but also makes them feel then also they as the donor are contributing to the story to make the story happen.
Wonderful. That's great advice. Great advice. On that note, it is now 3:09, and I promised I would only run over by 10 minutes to be respectful of everybody's time, both from our panelists and our participants. But I especially want to thank our panelists today, Jessica, Michael, Sarah. Thank you so much for your time, your talents, and your experience. I have found our conversation fascinating. I knew I would. I hope everyone else has found it valuable today. And we will be having another convening before the end of the year. We will be letting you know exactly when that is soon. Keep an eye on your emails for it. And in the meantime, best of we wish you well in all your efforts, and thank you for being with us today. Take care.
Hi, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.